No matter how you look at it, the Harry Potter franchise is kind of dead right now.
Harry Potter is dead!
Granted, this is a bit of a downer note to start on for a video about why I love Harry Potter, but I think the current staleness with the series must be addressed up front. Part of the static nature with the franchise right now has to do with the way Warner Brothers and J.K. Rowling haven't let it rest for long enough before pushing more upon us. If you were to release the Fantastic Beasts movies 15 years from now, once more of the people who grew up with Harry Potter were in their 30s and 40s, I guarantee the hype and success around them would be that much more abundant. But as it stands, nobody really asked for these Fantastic Beasts movies at this point anyway, and forcing 5 of them down our throats just doesn't help the case for the franchise as a whole. Neither does a stage play that's marketed as a book when it really only works if you see it live in person. It also doesn't do much for the HP brand that the genre that it's a part of is not nearly as big as it once was. The whole subcategory of fantasy that revolves around medieval kingdoms, magic, sorcerers, dragons, swords, goblins, and unicorns made a huge mark on the cinema landscape in the early 2000s. After 9/11, people were looking for pure escapism and black and white good guys and bad guys. But since then, it peaked with Deathly Hallows Part 2, started its decline with the Hobbit trilogy, and spare for a few exceptions hasn't amounted to much, at least in the movie world since. Other manifestations of that escapism people still desire have taken the place of the one that focused on knights in shining armor and wizards. Stuff like Star Wars and Marvel is still fantasy to a degree, just a different kind of fantasy in execution. Of course, that's not to say that Harry Potter was ever a full-fledged fantasy in the way that Lord of the Rings and the Chronicles of Narnia were. It's set in a version of the present-day real world, after all, and the worldview isn't quite as black and white as its siblings in Middle-earth. But the HP series still contains many of the mythical tropes people have become tired of, from dragons to magic spells, and I think the mainstream public doesn't really care about the nuances that make it different, at least at this point in time. Many people see it as the last remnant of a genre that's just not a thing nearly as much as it once was. Whether they're right is up for debate. Never fret though, my fellow Potterheads. This series will make a return to the beloved pedestal it used to be on someday. The life cycle of a product always declines eventually, but just like with Star Wars, nostalgia will bring it back. Give it 10, 15 years, maybe 20, and when they make the inevitable movie adaptation of that awful stage play, Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, we'll all be rushing to see it. Hey guys, that was the intro. I know, it was a long one, but to be fair, this is gonna have to be a long video. I've never, ever made a video about Harry Potter before, and that's kind of been by design. It's just always been way too hard for me to capture my thoughts about this series in one go. But over the past 2 months, I've been vigorously preparing for a video like this one. I've rewatched the films twice each, I've read countless analysis pieces and think pieces and college essays. I listened to the 21-hour audiobook of The Deathly Hallows all over again. I found old photos and videos of Harry Potter stuff from my childhood. It's the most I've ever prepared for a video in my entire life. And so today, after much script writing and revising and rewatching of films and research, I am finally in the right frame of mind to do the impossible. Today, you and I are going to deconstruct Harry Potter. Alright, before you ask, I'll tell you up front, it may or may not be a surprise to find that I am very much a Gryffindor. My Patronus is a snow leopard, and my favorite character is probably Remus Lupin. Here's my ranking of the HP books and the movies. I started the Harry Potter series at 7 years old, partly perusing on my own, partly having it read to me by my loving mother, and partly listening to the wonderful and underappreciated audiobooks narrated by Jim Dale. For most of my formative years, Harry Potter was my thing. I remember introducing myself at a new school one time by saying, "Hi, I'm Houston, and I love Harry Potter more than anything on the planet." I went to the midnight premieres with my family, I had the movie props, and the memorabilia. I read every Insider magazine and quote collector's edition behind the scenes book. I even had a life-size standee of Harry in my room, which I mean, I still have, I guess. It's in the basement. Even as a kid, seeing the Harry Potter movies in theaters instilled in me a passion and curiosity for how movies are made, just as the books had instilled in me an intrigue for how stories are told. I can honestly say that I would not be following the passions, hobbies, and callings that I do today if I hadn't grown up loving this series. It opened a wide gateway to everything else that I'd eventually come to identify with. Also, and I'm gonna be real with you guys, Emma Watson was definitely my first crush. Boy oh boy, I'm glad the childhood heroes I had in 2008 were different than the ones kids in 2018 are left with.
So this is a journal from when I was about 8. Let's see what I was writing about at that age. Oh my gosh. Emma Watson. I'm in love with her. She has a British accent. I wanted to print it in color, but I had trouble with the copier. Houston, you psycho.
See, you've got to understand, Chris Stuckman style, I grew up with these characters, reading this series, and I evolved with them. I saw my life as a Harry Potter book, with me as the protagonist, my teachers as the professors, and anybody I didn't like as Draco Malfoy. You know, some of my friends wanted to pilot X-Wings or drive Transformers, but I just wanted to attend wizard school and meet all the people that I loved there. Yes, this is gonna be good. As my life has continued and I've neared adulthood though, Harry Potter has persisted and held a constantly shifting but relevant place in my heart, no matter what age or season I find myself in. If I were to pick up any one of the 7 books and read a chapter right now, there would always be a theme or message that's pertinent to how I live my life and how I approach whatever's next. But seriously, enough about me. So at this point you may be asking yourself, are we going to focus more on the books or the movies in this video? And the answer is both. We will be discussing the films and the merits and ambitions of them, plus the big question of whether they live up to the books, but once we move on to the plot dissection and themes in Harry, it's probably going to rely on more information that you only know if you've read all 7 novels. Let's open this up. Here we go. This is gonna be good. Yes! As you can see, I also bought some old Harry Potter PC games from 2003 that hopefully we can play throughout the course of the video. I don't know, it should be fun. I think people have forgotten just how huge Harry Potter was only a few years ago. The movies were some of the highest grossing of all time, Deathly Hallows shattered box office records in its day, but before that, the books were just as much of a craze. Never before and never again since has a book series garnered so much popularity and cultural relevance in every facet of the media. People were talking about Harry Potter on late night TV, parents were discussing the merits of the books and some were trying to have them banned, kids and young adults alike were treating it like a fashion craze, and it started to get to the point where you were a rebellious rule breaker if you hadn't read at least one Harry Potter book. In the early 2000s, J.K. Rowling was a massive superstar. It was well known that she had 7 books planned, that she'd already written the final chapter, and we were all waiting with bated breath for the next installment and the midnight book party it would entail. She claimed to have spent 5 years just planning the story and background of the wizarding world, and that was very evident in everything she wrote, and the way she could answer any question about her lore on a dime.
So this is the name of everyone in Harry's year, and all these little symbols mean what house they're in, how magical they are, what their parentage is, because I needed this later for the Death Eaters and so on, and the various allegiances that would be set up within the school.
Rowling's life story, too, was one of extremely unlikely but inspiring circumstances, perfect for tabloids and Lifetime TV movies to romanticize, but still true all the way through. When she wrote Harry Potter, Jo was as close as you can get to being homeless in the UK while still having a roof over your head. Now, she's the first person to ever reach billionaire status from writing books, and also the first to subsequently lose that status because she donates so much to charities. It dawned on me the other day that the Harry Potter franchise became popular right around the time that the internet was starting to be used by everyone on the planet. Because of this, in the early days, Harry Potter craze was very much defined by the rudimentary fan sites that were inhabited by like-minded Potterheads on the net. Passionate fans would go to the midnight book release for the latest installment, read it in less than a day, and then eagerly discuss the meaning of every chapter on forums with people all around the world. And when YouTube launched in 2005, it too was heavily influenced by HP fandom. I grew up in this age, where Harry Potter parodies and animations and songs were a dime a dozen, and some of them I still hum or quote absent-mindedly to this day.
Snipe, snipe, Severus Snape, 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 Severus Snape,
Dumbledore!
Snape.
Of course, you pair the dawn of the internet with the fact that the books were still coming out as the movies were being released, and you have perfect soil for a fan base to grow. And after the first movie came out, that's exactly what it did. Most of the stuff presented in this video is my opinion, but here's a very real fact. The Harry Potter film series was one of the most ambitious blockbuster projects ever put to screen. A 10-year-long story that followed its main actors as they grew up in front of the audience's very eyes. It was unprecedented, and to be honest, it still kinda is. What's more impressive is the consistency that was maintained throughout the decade of making the saga. The locations and practical set pieces stayed the same, the screenwriting, VFX, and production teams stayed the same, and more importantly, the cast, spare for a few unavoidable changes, remained remarkably uniform throughout the entire ordeal. Emma Watson thought about leaving the series after the 5th movie, but managed to convince herself to stay, and regretted considering otherwise for years after.
I think I probably would have been public enemy number 1. I would not have been very popular. I think I would have found it very difficult watching the movies being made without me being part of them.
It's not just the consistency of the main trio that mattered, though. One of the key things that made the HP universe feel so real was the unchanging supporting cast, mainly comprised of esteemed British actors who stayed on for all 8. People like Maggie Smith, Robbie Coltrane, Alan Rickman, Richard Griffiths, John Hurt, Jason Isaacs, Gary Oldman, Julie Walters, they made everything feel alive and larger than life. The only aspect of the HP movies that changed drastically from film to film was the director. The first 2 were put together by Chris Columbus of Home Alone fame. Prisoner of Azkaban was directed by visionary Alfonso Cuarón, Goblet of Fire saw Mike Newell take on the mantle, and then the final 4 films were headed up by David Yates. This method turned out to be healthier for the franchise than was initially expected. When Columbus announced he was leaving after Chamber of Secrets because he didn't want to miss seeing his own kids grow up, many said it was the end for the series already. But much like the original Star Wars trilogy benefited from having multiple leaders take a turn at steering the ship, the HP franchise was heavily aided by having several different voices contribute their part to form it for the final half. This was one of many expert decisions by the producers and higher-ups that made the films happen, many of whom were clearly passionate about the source material and stuck with the project till the end. The fact that someone like Steve Kloves, who adapted all 8 screenplays, stayed with the series for 10 years was vital to its success and consistency. And yes, I did say all 8 screenplays. I'll argue day and night with anyone who says the splitting of Deathly Hallows into 2 parts was just for the money. But if you want to talk about just for the money, in retrospect, there were so many ways the films could have gone wrong or completely misunderstood the source. Before their release, many were skeptical that they would tarnish the name of the Harry Potter brand or crush the entire literary fan base.
I worry that we're enjoying the twilight of the innocence of this whole thing, because once the lunchboxes come along, and once the movie goes into production, and once it gets to be a kind of toy tie-in merchandising phenomenon, I hope they don't spoil it.
Luckily, the first 2 movies had a myriad of people who cared deeply about the roots of the source material, and J.K. Rowling herself was not about to let it be destroyed. Her top priority was making sure the films were shot exclusively in the UK and never taken to Hollywood.
I think that J.K. Rowling was absolutely faultless in the way she insisted that the films were made in England.
You have a huge proportion of the British film industry working here. A massive amount of skill in makeup, in design, and in lighting.
The importance of Chris Columbus starting out the series cannot be overstated. Many people tend to disregard the first 2 Columbus-directed movies as kids' fluff, because the actors were still young and the stories weren't nearly as complex, but they still played a substantial part in setting up the look and feel of the Wizarding World for the other 6 movies to come. The locations and set pieces of Hogwarts, the iconic musical score by John Williams, the adventurous tone, and of course the mind-blowingly perfect casting choices for the original trio, all of it was done under the watchful eye of Chris Columbus. The Columbus films are very old Hollywood, classically made and even Spielbergian at times. And who could have predicted that all three of these child actors would wind up growing into terrific performers by the end of the series? Well, him, apparently.
Nobody else, I maintain, could have started this series off in the way that Chris did. Because before you let people like Alfonso come in and shake things up, you have to have somebody who gives you a solid basis in the foundations of these characters and the locations and the sets. And that's what Chris did brilliantly.
I'm not going to go through all the other directors to steer the franchise, but people like Alfonso Cuarón were also instrumental in upping the status quo and maturing the tone as the series went along. Some people will inevitably say that the contrast between the first HP movie and the last is not an easy one to swallow. If you compare the tone of The Philosopher's Stone to Deathly Hallows Part 2, it's like they're totally different worlds. The beauty of this series, however, both on paper and on screen, is the way it evolves and matures with the characters and with the audience. I'd argue that the constantly changing nature of the HP series was what made it so special in the end, instead of remaining static and stale all the way through. And we still haven't even commented on the obvious technical achievements of the series. All 8 films are beautifully shot, but specifically the last 3, which have some poignant visual storytelling and communication of ideas through the composition. The VFX throughout the series, too, remained remarkably ahead of their time when each came out. The Quidditch stuff in Philosopher's Stone, while it looks dated now, was totally revolutionary and like nothing people had ever seen before in 2001. And the on-set crews at Leavesden Studios always prioritized practical effects over anything created in a computer, from animatronic creatures to real explosions.
The main criterion as far as myself and a lot of other people are concerned is that if you do it for real, it looks better. That's what I've spent or I've devoted my life to doing, and I'm certainly not going to change it now.
Even the musical score, while it went through 4 different composers, managed to set a distinct and beautiful tone for each film, which I'd argue might not have been achieved if Williams had been assigned to compose all 8. I mean, just listen to each of these tracks. They're incredible, and they're all from different artists. Alright, so from here on out, we're going to be talking about the complexities of the plot of Harry Potter. No more technical mumbo-jumbo or discussions about the filmmaking, just themes and characters and everything else. So, if you haven't read the books and you've made it this far, needless to say, spoilers abound. Go read the books, go watch all the movies. It should only take you, a day or so. Also, does anyone know how to make video games from 2003 work on their current PC? Because all I'm getting is error messages. What? So the first question you might ask yourself is, did the movies do the books justice? Could you watch the Harry Potter films without reading the books and still have a satisfying experience? And the answer is kinda? First of all, it's challenging for me to comment on this because I read all the books before I saw any of the movies, and so sometimes I forget what was and wasn't in them. I project my visions of the books onto the movies instead of vice versa. So for instance, the other day I was watching Deathly Hallows Part 2, and I realized that the mirror Harry owns, which allows Aberforth Dumbledore to watch him, is never set up, and where he got it is never explained in the movies. In the books, it belonged to Sirius, who gave it to him in Order of the Phoenix, know, it's complicated. But until recently, I hadn't thought about what an average audience member would think when they saw that that plot point had no explanation, and it certainly opened my eyes to how many things in the movies really do come out of nowhere if you had no prior knowledge of the books. There are definitely some changes in the films, or omissions rather, that don't do the stories any favors. And some of these omissions make the story seem a whole lot shallower than it really is if you're just watching the movies without context. For instance, in the books, the magical prophecy that essentially foretells Harry as the Chosen One is given a lot more backstory and complexity. The legitimacy of the prophecy and fortune-telling as an ability are questioned, the prophecy is somewhat up to interpretation, and it doesn't just tell us what's going to happen in the end. J.K. Rowling made sure in her novels that it was far more than just another fantasy hero trope. If you've only seen the movies though, well, it does seem like every other Chosen One scenario from Star Wars to The Matrix. On top of that, Harry himself in the books is an extremely internal character. In a book written in third person, J.K. Rowling was able to examine his inner psyche and thought process on a dime, but in the movies, we can only see what Daniel Radcliffe's performance gives us. Sometimes this is a great thing, but sometimes it's not nearly as effective.
So much of what I could do with Harry was have an internal soliloquy. You know, I could show Harry's inner musings. I could take the reader into Harry's internal space and show them around. This character whose life is maybe 80% internal, you're forced to show us that externally. So I always felt that you had a much rougher job than I did when it came to Harry the character.
Voldemort, too, is not nearly as layered in the films as he is in the books. That's because almost 90% of the Half-Blood Prince is about going back and figuring out Tom Riddle's backstory and what made him the way he is. It's fascinating stuff and serves to make him an extremely nuanced antagonist, questioning the nature versus nurture of his psychopathic tendencies. The movie adaptation only touches on this backstory briefly, and it doesn't really do much to differentiate Voldemort from every other supervillain in fantasy culture. Ralph Fiennes is charismatic and brilliant in the role, but he can only do so much. Of course, I could just rattle off a list of every little great thing that's in the books that's not in the movies. From Hermione's house elf civil rights group, to Harry's complicated romance with Cho Chang, to the story of the Marauders, to the whole plot point where Neville was almost the Chosen One, to Harry and Ginny's far more developed relationship, to Peter Pettigrew's small redemption and demise, to Harry's goodbye with the Dursleys, to the more detailed explanation of Harry's resurrection, to Voldemort's very different defeat surrounded by a crowd, to Remus Lupin's son with Harry as his godfather, but I'm not going to list all that stuff. There are some changes in the movies that were more than warranted and in fact benefited the larger picture. I'd give my life to keep that Harry-Hermione dancing scene in Hallows Part 1. Luna Lovegood and Neville Longbottom's romance was a happy accident that nobody could have foreseen, but it actually makes their character resolutions more satisfying. And there's plenty of fat in the books that, while it works on the page, was not vital to see in the films. Nobody cares about seeing Nearly Headless Nick's Death Day party.
I think that as the series went on, though, I think that you were given more latitude to improvise, as you say, and I think that was great for the films.
Well, you would always encourage it, though. You would always say...
This is the irony. Everyone always assumes I would say, don't change a word! But actually, quite the reverse. I used to say, yeah, change it. I mean, I know perfectly well there were things that were very losable in Goblet and Phoenix if you weren't going to make the 8-hour movie. I mean, as it turns out, I said to you years previously, which I couldn't remember at all, but I knew that.
I guess the conclusion I'd fall on for whether the movies live up to the books is this. The Harry Potter books, as you'd guess, will always have more depth, nuance, world building, and story in general than the films. That's just how turning a 700-page story into a 2-hour movie, or even 2 2-hour movies, works. But I think, for the most part, the movies capture the feeling of the books. They capture the emotion and the heart and the world that readers loved so much. And more important than that, they capture the truth that makes this so potent and universal. And yeah, I mean, in many cases, they totally nail lots of the important stuff, from great casting choices for every character to wonderful set pieces that are just how you imagine they'd be. So to me, despite the various shortcomings here and there, these movies are probably the best adaptations we could have reasonably asked for. And let's be honest, they could have been much worse.
So I couldn't get that Prisoner of Azkaban game to work, but for the time being, I think our best bet may be LEGO Harry Potter. When I was a kid, Harry Potter's influence on my life was a lot simpler and, as you'd expect, more childlike than it is now, but it nevertheless instilled in me many different virtues that I still carry to this day. J.K. Rowling's series since the beginning has always placed friendship, loyalty, and following an objective moral compass as a true good above everything else. Looking back, I think about reading the series during my formative years and how different I am because of it. To this day, I tend to value loyalty and close bonds with people I trust above almost anything else the rest of the world has to offer, and I think that came from watching Harry, Ron, and Hermione's intimate friendship. I aspired to be that close and open with other people who would in turn be close and open with me, uniting with a group of friends to take on the world. Harry could never do anything without the support of his friends, and as such, it taught me that I can't close myself off and try to go at everything alone. The other idea I think the books instilled in children in general from an early age, especially in the first few installments, was that the authority in place, while important, is never the ultimate authority. A moral compass should be what drives you forward in any circumstance, and if you know that you can break the rules to help other people instead of harm them, you should go for it. It's what Harry and his friends do all the time when they're at Hogwarts, just to eventually save the day, because often they know better than the teachers themselves, or in latter installments, the corrupt government is actively trying to limit their involvement.
There are people who are uncomfortable with the fact that I explore morality to an extent. In other words, the children do challenge accepted authority, they do break rules. I think those are healthy things. I'm never going to agree with someone who feels that you should shut up and do what you're told because I'm older than you. I just don't believe that is a good basis for discipline or education. I really don't.
Of course, looking back on that lesson, I also think now that there was far more to it than just don't listen to your teachers. There are plenty of times in the series where Harry's rebelliousness towards authority and impulsivity to run off and save people gets him into more trouble than it's probably worth. Heck, for much of Philosopher's Stone, the main trio thinks they're trying to take down Snape, mainly because Harry has a personal vendetta against him, but it turns out the villain was Quirrell the whole time. Even our hot-headed protagonist can make mistakes or have lapses in judgment. There's almost nobody in the Harry Potter books who should be your role model through and through, just like how even people you look up to in real life are never perfect. Every character in the series is flawed in some way, and it's your choice to decide whether they're redeemable despite those flaws. That's part of the beautiful nuance of the saga. Sirius Black's line about how the world isn't split up into good people and Death Eaters rings true throughout the entirety of Harry's life. J.K. Rowling has always made it clear that the concepts of good and evil are very real and powerful, and the HP books are about a battle between good and evil. The thing that makes this different than many other good versus evil storylines, though, is that the people within that battle are all shades of gray. Harry's precious father James was an honorable man in later life, but also a massive bully in school. Dudley Dursley was a horrible person to Harry, but is ultimately grateful to him for saving his life. Remus Lupin was one of the kindest and most important mentors in the series, but he also goes through a period where he considers abandoning his wife and newborn child. Xenophilius Lovegood is brave enough to print papers supporting Harry and his mission, but ends up turning him in as soon as his daughter Luna is kidnapped. Severus Snape was no perfect hero. He was elitist and hateful towards James and Harry, and lest we forget, did authentically serve Voldemort for a period. But he also cared deeply enough about someone to die for them, and was brave enough to be a double agent for Dumbledore when he was at his most vulnerable. And Dumbledore, well, we'll save him for later. The point is, nobody is just one thing. All the greatest stories ever told, from Hamlet to Hamilton, will make that very clear. While the concepts of good and evil do exist, human beings are never simple enough to be confined to only one of them. Speaking of the inherently flawed characters within the world of Harry Potter, though, let's talk about the wizarding community and its hierarchy as a whole. One thing people rarely seem to comment on when they talk about HP is the level at which J.K. Rowling's world is essentially a satire of ours. Which is to say, contrary to what it seems in the first couple installments, the magical world is a deeply flawed, hierarchical, racist, and systematically oppressive place, and this is by design. Having magic solves a plethora of problems, but it also creates larger ones in its wake.
But I think, again, it's about this world is cruel.
Mm-hmm.
And
it's as cruel as our world.
Oh, yeah.
It's a mirror image.
Yeah. Yeah.
And just as they can solve things that we can't solve, so they can create problems that we don't have. And that's always been the problem for Harry, that he enters this world and believes it will be an escape. And it's not. Human nature is human nature, whether or not you can use a wand.
Over the course of the book series, Harry's perception of his world goes from delightfully simple and full of wonder to seeing a place with gaping problems and institutionalized mindsets. The series, as we've discussed, matures with the reader, and this is just one of the many ways that occurs. One of my favorite reveals in the novel of The Goblet of Fire, which isn't in the movie, is the fact that enslaved house elves are the ones that provide the feasts in the Great Hall. Feasts that hitherto had appeared to be conjured from thin air. It's a pretty big revelation to Harry that all food must come from somewhere, and even the place that he views as a nurturing home has its own moral shortcomings and succumbs to the oppressive customs of the world it exists in. Ron Weasley himself exemplifies this idea. He's the only character of the main trio who grew up in the wizarding world, and as such, he maintains several of the toxic mindsets that are popularized within it. People who grow up in a society with systematic wrongdoing are often blind to it or see it as the norm, and the situation needs an outsider like Hermione or Harry to truly notice the injustice. Near the start of the series, Ron is prejudiced against certain breeds, he doesn't really get why Hermione would want to free the house elves, and he's got plenty of other oversimplified ideas that he just hasn't been told otherwise on. The lesson here is clear. Even good-hearted people can have poisonous mindsets, and that doesn't mean you should stop loving them or write them off entirely. Instead, show them the right way to look at things. It takes Ron a long time to come around, but he does eventually see Hermione's point of view on the issue and ends up being the one to suggest that they get the house elves to safety during the Battle of Hogwarts. You have to make a conscious choice to fight injustice, or else you just become part of the machine. Of course, there's far more to the social commentary of the wizarding world than just house elves. The corrupt media and how it distorts the truth has always been a recurring concept in Harry. Rita Skeeter uses a magical quill which essentially strips all of the nuance from her subject's statements and turns them into gossipy headlines.
My eyes aren't glistening with the ghost of my past.
The media in Harry is essentially controlled by the government. In later books, it spews blatant propaganda, but everybody reads it because the wizarding community is relatively small and it's honestly their only option. This is a huge problem because when you don't have a variety of sources to get your information from, it can be easily tampered with or censored altogether. A small family-owned newspaper like Luna Lovegood's The Quibbler very much represents the fringe media that, while not taken seriously by many in power, is still making an attempt to influence the cultural moment. The Daily Prophet exemplifies a news outlet that doesn't always blatantly lie to its readers, but instead takes small grains of truth and strips them of their subtleties and subjectivity.
The Daily Prophet's been saying a lot of things about you, Harry. And about Dumbledore as well.
What, and your mum believes them?
The slander that they print about Dumbledore in later books is, for the most part, factual. But when we hear accounts of the controversial events from his youth from the people who were really there, like Elphias Doge or Dumbledore himself, we start to understand how they could have transpired, and why he might have made the decisions that sound otherwise cold-hearted on paper. And that's, I think, part of what J.K. Rowling has to say about the press in Harry Potter and anyone who judges situations from afar without being there. If you truly want to turn it into gossip, you can make anything sound despicable on paper. But unless you were there, you'll probably never understand the nuances of the circumstance secondhand. The idea that oppressive societies will do whatever they can to control what people know and learn does not stop with the Daily Prophet. In Order of the Phoenix, the Ministry of Magic itself has a direct hand in dumbing down the truth for students in Hogwarts just to make it seem like Cornelius Fudge has everything under control.
Your previous instruction in this subject has been disturbingly uneven. But you'll be pleased to know, from now on, you will be following a carefully structured, ministry-approved course of defensive magic.
The Ministry of Magic's hand in enforcing the law is deeply corrupt, and this is intentional. Cornelius Fudge pretends to be a leader who has every aspect of his community firmly grasped. but he and many other ministry officials are clearly just making the whole thing up as they go, changing the rules at will for personal and political gain. Whether it's Fudge saying,
"Laws can be changed if necessary, Dumbledore,"
or the fact that Sirius was sent to Azkaban with no trial, or the presence of Dementors at hearings to deprive the defendant of a clear thought process, the list of injustices is sprawling. As you'd expect, there have been numerous comparisons of the Ministry of Magic's behavior to specific modern-day politicians and administrations, many of whom, that I won't name here, have been accused of covering up their slapdash carelessness just to keep their followers level-headed. There are other political themes we could address. The ethics of torture is a major part of the latter installments. How a truly effective leader should handle power is another big question. The way the wizarding community enslaves and shuns creatures they don't deem worthy of respect is a potent issue, but I think the biggest affair not touched on yet is Voldemort and his similarities to Hitler, and that of his regime to Nazi Germany. Obviously, both Voldemort and Hitler aim to eradicate or oppress a certain subset of people, initially registering and tracking them with the government and eventually wiping them off the slate altogether. For Hitler, this people group was the Jews. For Voldemort, it's Muggle-borns and half-bloods in society. Many in the wizarding community share this belief, the belief that purebloods are the only true wizards in the long run.
There's some wizards, like the Malfoy family, who think they're better than everyone else because they're what people call pure blood, dirty blood. Why, there isn't a wizard alive today that's not half-blood or less.
Of course, both Voldemort and Hitler's oppressive ideologies are paradoxical for several reasons, including what Hagrid says, which is that purebloods are virtually a myth. Everyone has Muggle ancestry somewhere. Chief of these reasons, however, is that neither Tom Riddle or Adolf Hitler is actually a part of the superior race they aim to promote. Voldemort is a half-blood, meaning his father was a Muggle, the very thing he hates. And Hitler, wait for it, had Jewish ancestry, was born outside of Germany, and did not look Aryan by any means. Many have speculated that both Voldemort and Hitler's quest to eradicate the very people groups that they belong to each represent a kind of raw and subconscious self-loathing on their behalf. And with Tom Riddle specifically, it's not hard to see. In the books, we witness him murder his Muggle family and his
filthy Muggle fathers
because he's so ashamed of his lineage. An argument can also be made that neither Hitler or Voldemort cared about cleansing their supposed inferior race in the end nearly as much as they just wanted power and saw a way to seize it. Seeing that so many powerful families and bloodlines in the rest of the wizarding world wanted mudbloods off the table, Tom Riddle decided he was gonna bank hard on that because it would win him followers. Hitler did something similar, preying on the inborn prejudices of the people of Germany and growing fear that their country was not their own anymore and they needed to take it back. Bear in mind that both leaders came into their most prominent positions of power after their base of followers had lost a previous war. Germany lost World War I, which prompted their quick backing of a man who would make them great again. Voldemort's followers lost the First Wizarding War and were all too eager to make a comeback as well. So what is J.K. Rowling trying to say through these historical parallels with Nazi Germany? Well, it's a time-honored literary tradition to liken your villain to Hitler in some way, but I think what Voldemort specifically shows is that men who want power will do anything to get it, and often they will prey on the subconscious fears, prejudices, and desires of their base just to elevate them to a high status. The world J.K. Rowling leaves us with at the end of Deathly Hallows is far from a utopia. Our heroes have won the ultimate battle, but there still remain a plethora of issues, from house elf rights to government corruption, that remain unresolved. Luckily, Harry and his friends like Hermione, a regular old social justice warrior, are clearly fighting the good fight, trying to redeem this broken world in every small way they can, even if that just means raising a family. Alright, I'm done with this game. Back to my old hobbit hole it is, I guess. If there's one thing that's clear to me through reading J.K. Rowling's writing and world building, it's that she has a very clear knowledge of world history, mythology, and even etymology. There have been various critics over the years who have claimed that Harry Potter is not all that original, and that it reuses concepts from other sources and tries to pass them off as its own. To me, though, Harry Potter has never tried to pass off the more familiar aspects of its world as something wholly original. Instead, J.K. Rowling is constantly making callbacks and nods to the legends and cultures that inspired her in the first place, with some even tied directly to the canon. In the context of Rowling's wizarding world, it's very likely that some of the myths she makes references to actually occurred, at least partially. The general consensus implied in the books is that lots of our Muggle mythologies are actually based on early exposure to witches and wizards before they went into hiding, chalking them up to be gods or angels or demons or whatever else. The further you go into the mythological and historical callbacks in Rowling's work, the more you start to wonder what was intentional and what is just a miraculous coincidence. Her name choices specifically have always been very pointed. There are the more obvious characters like Sirius, a man who transforms into a dog and is aptly named after the dog constellation, or Remus Lupin, a man who transforms into a werewolf named after both Remus, the Roman emperor raised by wolves, and Lupus, the Latin word meaning wolf. Then there are the more unknown parallels, like QUIRINUS QUIRRELL in Philosopher's Stone, who was named for the Roman god Janus QUIRINUS, a man with two faces, or Argus Filch, named after the mythical Argus who had eyes all over his body to see intruders. Rowling also employed the use of Victorian flower language and symbolism in nature for some of her plot devices. Voldemort's wand is made of the wood from a yew tree, a species that is specifically poisonous, often grows in graveyards, and for centuries has represented immortality or an omen of doom. Harry's wand, on the other hand, is made of the wood from a holly tree, which usually represents good luck or protection from evil. Lily and her sister Petunia are also appropriately named for the Victorian flower language. Lily's represent beauty and innocence of heart, and Petunia's represent annoyance or anger. Of course, you're probably aware of the more obvious callbacks to European mythology in the creatures Rowling puts into her world. Hippogriffs, phoenixes, centaurs, merpeople, elves, goblins, dragons, a three-headed dog that parallels Cerberus, all that stuff comes from classic myth, accompanied by some other creatures that Jo invented herself, like Dementors, which represented her depression at the time. But you get the idea. It's difficult to talk about what Harry Potter means and the artistry involved without discussing the Christian symbolism and parallels contained, especially within the last book. This is ironic, of course, because Christians were by far the most vocal opponents of Harry Potter in its early days. I still remember growing up with loads of friends whose parents said Harry Potter would make them want to, I don't know, do sorcery or something. This is despite the fact, of course, that J.K. Rowling has repeatedly said that the books are not instructional materials, that she doesn't believe in magic, and that they have a distinctly Christian background, especially in the latter half.
I'm not pushing any belief system here, although there is a lot of Christian imagery in the books. That's undeniable. And certainly in Hallows, there's a very clear...
The irony is, while the demographic of Christians who vehemently oppose Harry Potter has lessened quite a bit, those that still do are missing out on a beautiful illustration of the story of Christ. Now, that's not to say that the entire HP series is completely allegorical, and J.K. Rowling herself has said that she didn't write the books to push any kind of religious or political message. Similar to Lewis or Tolkien with their respective worlds, Jo started with the surface-level idea of a wizard school, and the religious metaphors seeped in organically over time. Anyone can read the Potter books and find the story applicable to their life in its own way, no matter what their religious beliefs are. However, if you want to look for the shadows of Christianity, which Jo calls allusions to the belief system she was raised with, there's plenty of substance to dissect. Even Jo herself once said that she didn't want to reveal that she was a Christian early on because people might catch on to the allegory and see where the story was going. Now, bear in mind, this is my interpretation. It's what the metaphors mean to me. That doesn't mean you have to interpret everything the same way, but I think it's pretty interesting to see what Jo intended and what is subjective in the long run. Harry's journey throughout all 7 books parallels that of Christ in the Gospels in a myriad of ways. The more obvious examples, Harry's band of friends can be likened to Christ's disciples. Harry is part Muggle and part wizard, just as how Christ was part human and part God. The fickle society around Harry sometimes praises him, but also persecutes him when he speaks truth they don't like. And then there's the blatant death and resurrection, which we'll get to. Deathly Hallows is the book where the Christ parallels really cement themselves. From the start, Harry has been given a seemingly insurmountable task by Dumbledore, just as Jesus was tasked by God. And along the way, both of them deal with temptations to distrust their godlike mentor or use their earthly power to win the day. It may or may not surprise some to find that I compare Dumbledore to God the Father in Harry's Christ metaphor. This is interesting because J.K. Rowling herself has said a few times that she sees him as more a John the Baptist figure. Personally, though, I feel there's no comparison more apt than that of Dumbledore to the God of the New Testament. And again, the HP books are not pure allegory. Dumbledore has a problematic and flawed past. The God of the New Testament presumably does not. But on the whole, Dumbledore's place in the larger narrative still serves the purpose of a god figure. In Deathly Hallows especially, he's the mentor that Harry can't see but must believe has a plan for him, with Harry taking it on faith in the experiences he's endured and trusting the man he knew despite his doubts.
I trusted the man I knew. We need to get into the castle tonight.
Dumbledore maintains a balance of caring about Harry's ultimate well-being and loving him like a son, while still realizing that he needs to prioritize the greater good of wizard kind. This parallels how the Bible describes God as caring about his children and loving them, but not always keeping them from all pain and suffering, especially if that suffering benefits a larger purpose for humanity. Just like Dumbledore with Harry, the Bible's God the Father puts his own son, or in Albus's case, surrogate son, in a position to die so that everyone else might live. In the Gospels, Jesus is consistently presented with the other way he could use or abuse his supernatural power. God's plan set out for him is ultimately to sacrifice himself for the greater good, but Satan and even the disciples often question why Jesus doesn't just overpower those in authority or call down angels from heaven to smite the Romans and make him the all-powerful king of the Jews. Harry is faced with similar choices. Throughout Deathly Hallows, many of his so-called disciples urge him to abandon Dumbledore's quest at every turn, from Ron Weasley to Dumbledore's own brother Aberforth. People like Rita Skeeter sow the inklings of doubt in Harry's mind that he wrestles with throughout the first 2 acts of the book. Harry knows his task, set before him by Dumbledore, is to find the Horcruxes and destroy them, and later, like Christ, to sacrifice himself. But he's also presented with the tempting notion of confronting Voldemort head-on, playing the reckless hero and disregarding authority, as has been his tradition in this series. Harry's character arc in the Deathly Hallows hinges on learning to trust in Dumbledore's plan, instead of abandoning it and attempting to one-up Voldemort's earthly power, the equivalent of Jesus using his godlike powers to smite the Romans instead of turning himself in. Lots of people question why the Deathly Hallows were in the final book, especially since we already have enough convoluted magical artifacts, MacGuffins, and legends to deal with already. And I asked myself this question for a while too. But I think the Hallows exist to be the alluring potential of what Harry could become if he were to pursue them as Dumbledore did in his youth. When people tell Harry to abandon the quest Dumbledore gave him, there needs to be a tempting alternative he could seek instead if he so desired. Harry knows he must go after the Horcruxes. Dumbledore told him so. But the idea of being master of death, of holding the unbeatable wand, sounds a lot more appealing to him, especially when the trio is camping out in a tent and he doesn't feel like he's making much difference in the war. In Christ's story, I think the Deathly Hallows really represent the supreme power of the Holy Trinity, power which Jesus could yield if he wanted to, as Harry could pursue the Hallows, but chooses to refrain from, as Harry does with the Elder Wand in the end. I don't believe it's a coincidence either that the Hallows could easily be taken as symbols of the Trinity. All-powerful Elder Wand, Stone of Resurrection, Invisibility Cloak. Try the all-powerful Father, Resurrected Son, and Invisible Holy Spirit. Hallow is another word for a saint or holy being, and the symbols for the Hallows and Trinity even share similarities in appearance. There are numerous other comparisons to be made, some of which could be incidental, but others were surely intended. The Harry Potter series blatantly defines snakes as the personification of malice and evil, which comes from the Bible in a roundabout sort of way. Harry being forced to die to rid the Horcrux from inside him mirrors how Christians must spiritually die to be reborn without sin. Prophecies and fortune-telling in both Potter and the Bible are treated as something that cannot and should not be controlled by humans, but must come instead from a more divine source. The books also treat children as perfectly capable of fighting evil, which harkens back to a verse in Timothy about not letting anyone look down upon you because you're young, and Dumbledore's remarks about choosing between what is right and what is easy are very reminiscent of the wide versus narrow paths that the Bible speaks of. The last real comparison between the two, and perhaps the most important, is the theme of love and death. But I think even despite the biblical parallels, this deserves a segment to itself. There are two specific biblical quotations featured in Harry Potter, and both come from the same scene, the scene where Harry and Hermione visit the graveyard in Godric's Hollow. The first verse featured is on the Dumbledore family's tombstone from Matthew 6, "Where your treasure is, your heart will be also." The second is a quotation from 1 Corinthians 15:26, and it's found on the Potter's grave. "The last enemy that shall be destroyed is death." J.K. Rowling has said that these two verses epitomize the entire series. Everything that the story means to her is contained in these two lines of text, and it's not entirely hard to see why. Let's talk about what they mean. "Where your treasure is, your heart will be also." In context, this verse is to some extent a warning. Jesus explains that if what you treasure most is materialistic, earthly substance or power, that's where your heart and attention will be. He advises instead to put your treasure in heaven, and when you do that, your heart will follow it there as well. Regardless of what you believe, the irony of this quotation being on the Dumbledore family's grave should not be lost. I see it almost like Albus, who likely chose the verse, is rebuking himself. His greed for earthly treasures and power like the Deathly Hallows was what led to the untimely death of his sister Ariana, who would have survived had he prioritized loving her and sacrificed his pride. The verse also heavily foreshadows Voldemort's fatal flaw. His treasure, and thus his heart, is found on Earth and nowhere else. I mean, think about it. The guy is insanely materialistic, and he always has been. When Tom Riddle was a kid, he would steal objects from his friends and hide them as trophies in a cabinet, and this only got worse as he learned dark magic and made Horcruxes, the worst kind of trophy imaginable, to bind himself to an earthly existence. His choice to literally put his soul into material objects that can be destroyed, rather than valuing love or friendship or the things that can't be locked in a cabinet, is what strips him down to nothing more than a husk of a human, withering away in limbo for all eternity. The second verse, "The last enemy that shall be destroyed is death." In context, this verse talks about how Christ conquered death by sacrificing himself, creating a way for the rest of humanity to have life in his wake. And if you've been paying attention even slightly, this clearly parallels Harry's sacrifice too. Harry conquers death by accepting his fate and sacrificing himself in love. In fact, Dumbledore says later that whether he had the Hallows or not, Harry was the true master of death because he accepted that he must die, and understood that there are far worse things in a living world than dying. This is a concept that has been totally unfathomable for Voldemort throughout the entire series. Tom Riddle, who we discover was conceived as the product of a love potion, has no concept of what love is, or how the lack of it could be worse than death, and Harry pities him for that.
Do not pity the dead, Harry. Pity the living. And above all those who live without love.
The largest parallel between the Gospel and all 7 books is the way both portray the profound power of sacrificial love and its ability to transcend death. In both the Bible and Potter, love acts as a shield, and the shedding of blood, giving up one's life for that of another, is the ultimate sacrifice in love, and it provides supernatural protection for whomever the victim died for. The Bible says, "Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." Jesus died for humanity, and in the Bible they were supernaturally protected from the consequences of sin by his sacrifice. Lily Potter died for her son Harry, and he was protected from Voldemort because of her sacrifice. And in the final book, Harry died for his friends, protecting and shielding them through his sacrifice. In both the Bible and Potter, sacrificial love literally creates a supernatural barrier that protects the recipient. Dumbledore calls this a kind of ancient magic that Voldemort could never begin to understand.
It was because of your mother. She sacrificed herself for you. And that kind of act leaves a mark. No, this kind of mark cannot be seen. It lives in your very skin.
What is it?
Love, Harry. Love.
Biblical references and mythologies and everything aside, love is the key to the Harry Potter series. Sure, you can call that sappy or generic, but I think the books do a lot more to define the abilities and profundity of love than something like, say, the Wonder Woman movie. In HP, love is what makes a soul live forever, and sacrificial love is ultimately what conquers death.
I felt it would be a betrayal of the character if I showed Harry doing anything other than living what all along he has discovered to be true, which is that love is the strongest power there is.
I can't believe it, but I think we're finally about to bring this video to a close. You know, it's funny. I started writing this analysis under the mindset that the Harry Potter movies are amazing masterpieces, and you don't need to read the books to love them. But after all this research and rewatching, I've come to the conclusion that they're worthy and beautifully crafted complements to the books, but you have to read the original text to get the full impact. There are some nuances that just can't be captured in one 2-hour movie. And before you go calling Harry Potter overrated because you've only seen the films, give the books a go. The films are very good, but they work mainly as a side dish, not the full course. So what does Harry Potter mean to me in the end? We've talked about a lot of stuff. Political metaphors and historical callbacks, mythological and religious parallels, the power of love and the meaning of death. But I think my affinity for Harry Potter can be summarized more simply in the little moments from the first movie, where we see a lonely orphan boy finally discover the home he deserves.
You're a wizard, Harry.
Whether it's Harry sitting on the windowsill after everyone's gone to bed, stroking his new pet and looking out into the distance, or waking up on Christmas to find that he's got presents for the first time in his life, or looking into the mirror of Erised to see two loving parents staring back at him. That's what Harry Potter means to me. It's just a lonely child finding a home and learning the power of love through his relationships with his friends and family. Relationships that endure even outside the boundaries of death itself. Well, thank you for sticking through this video. It was an honor and a joy to make, and I put a lot of care into making sure every summation was exactly how I wanted it to sound. This series, if you cannot absolutely tell already, means a great deal to me, and I hope that was conveyed in the best way it could be. I'm sure in a few years I'll come back to this video and have 10 times more things to say about what the series means to me then. If you made it to the end of this video, you brave soul, comment your Hogwarts house down below. I'm a Gryffindor, but I wouldn't be surprised if most of you are Ravenclaws. My subscribers are smart. If you enjoyed this analysis, liking, commenting, subscribing, even Patreon are all great, but my top priority would be to tell you to share it on social media. Nothing is better than getting the word out to more people. Anyway, I can't believe we went this whole video and I still couldn't figure out how to get this PC game to work. It's ridiculous. I spent $11 on eBay just to get this game to work, and now... Is that... It's working! It's working right now! It's working! I can't believe this! I went this whole video and now it starts? It's the loading screen! I remember this from my childhood! Okay, yes, new game. Alright, I think that's it for the video. Thank you for watching. I'll see you guys later. I'll probably be up all night playing this.
There once was a boy named Harry, destined to be a star. His parents were killed by Voldemort, who gave him a lightning scar. Yo, Harry, you a wizard. Harry goes to Hogwarts, he meets Ron and Hermione. McGonagall requires he play for Gryffindor. Draco is his daddy's boy, Quirrell becomes unemployed. The Sorcerer's Son is destroyed by Dumbledore.
I mean every word I ever say, ever, because I'm Harry Potter.